In a quiet corner of New England, there was a small liberal arts college where ideas clashed as often as the seasons changed. The campus buzzed with energy, students debating over coffee in the cafeteria, professors pacing through lecture halls, and endless discussions about politics, philosophy, and everything in between. Among these voices stood out one particularly loud and opinionated figure, a professor who loved to challenge his students. Let's call him Professor Hartley. Professor Hartley wasn't your typical teacher. He had a reputation for being sharp-tongued, quick-witted, and unapologetically progressive. His classes were lively, often turning into heated debates about social issues, economics, and government policies. While many admired his passion, others found him intimidating. Hartley didn't mince words when it came to critiquing views he disagreed with, especially if they leaned conservative. And among his students there was one who frequently caught his attention, not because she sought it, but because her calm confidence made her stand out. Her name was Karoline Leavitt. Unlike some of her peers, Karoline didn't raise her hand, just to argue or score points. She spoke thoughtfully, choosing her words carefully, always backing up her arguments with logic and evidence. What most people didn't know was that Karoline wasn't just smart, she was exceptionally gifted. Her IQ placed her in the top fraction of the population, though she rarely mentioned it. To her, intelligence wasn't something to flaunt. It was simply a tool to navigate life. Despite their ideological differences, Karoline and Professor Hartley often found themselves at odds during class discussions. Hartley prided himself on dismantling opposing viewpoints, and Karoline's measured conservatism provided plenty of fodder for his critiques. But what started as spirited exchanges soon took on a more personal tone. Hartley began singling her out, testing her patience and resolve. Some might have backed down under such pressure, but not Karoline. She met each challenge head-on, never raising her voice or losing her composure. One chilly autumn morning, the tension between them reached its peak. It happened during a debate about economic policy, a topic that always seemed to ignite sparks in Hartley's classroom. As usual, Karoline presented her case clearly and logically, explaining why she believed certain approaches could work better than others. Hartley listened intently at first, nodding occasionally as if considering her points. But then, midway through her argument, his expression shifted. A smirk crept onto his face, and before she could finish, he cut her off. No, he said, leaning casually against the podium. I think we're speaking different languages here. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him as he grabbed a piece of chalk and strode toward the blackboard. Without another word, he began scribbling furiously, filling the board with numbers, symbols, and equations so complicated they looked like hieroglyphics. When he stepped back, he turned to face the class, his smirk widening into a grin. Here's my challenge for you, he announced, pointing dramatically at the equation. If you can solve this, Miss Leavitt, maybe I'll take your arguments a little more seriously. His tone dripped with sarcasm, and a few students chuckled nervously. Others exchanged worried glances, knowing full well how difficult the problem appeared. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how Karoline would respond. But Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she rose slowly from her seat, her movements deliberate and calm. She walked to the front of the room, picked up a piece of chalk, and studied the equation silently. There was no hesitation, no sign of doubt in her demeanor. As she began working through the problem, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Conversations faded, pens stopped clicking, and even Hartley's confident smirk wavered slightly. Everyone watched as Karoline transformed the chaotic mess of symbols into something orderly and clear. Minutes ticked by, but no one dared interrupt. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Karoline stepped away from the board, leaving behind a neatly written solution beneath Hartley's original equation. The silence deepened as students craned their necks to get a better look. Then someone whispered, "She did it," followed by murmurs of disbelief. Not only had Karoline solved the problem, but she'd done so elegantly, simplifying steps that Hartley himself hadn't considered. For a brief moment, Hartley froze. His face flushed red as reality sank in. He'd underestimated her, big time. This wasn't just a student answering a question. It was a masterclass in intellectual humility. The very thing he prided himself on, his ability to dominate any intellectual battle, had been turned on its head, and all eyes were now on him, waiting to see how he'd react. The room was thick with tension, the kind that made everyone shift uncomfortably in their seats. Professor Hartley stood frozen at the front of the classroom, his eyes darting between Karoline and the chalkboard. For a man who thrived on being the smartest person in the room, this moment felt like a punch to the gut. He had expected defiance, maybe even frustration from Karoline when he issued his challenge. What he hadn't anticipated was calm, quiet brilliance, the kind that left no room for argument or excuse. Karoline turned to face the class, her expression neutral, almost serene. She didn't gloat or smirk. Instead, she simply said, "If there are any questions about the solution, I'd be happy to explain." Her voice was steady, her tone polite but firm. It wasn't arrogance, it was confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you've done something right. Some students nodded silently, while others exchanged wide-eyed glances. A few clapped, softly, unsure if they were allowed to celebrate such a moment in the middle of class. Hartley finally broke the silence, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Well, yes," he stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. "I suppose we can review the steps later. Let's move on to the next topic." But it was too late. The damage, or perhaps the lesson, had already been done. As he fumbled through the rest of the lecture, his usual sharpness seemed dulled, replaced by an uncharacteristic unease. Every time he glanced at Karoline, seated quietly in the second row, he couldn't help but feel a pang of embarrassment, mixed with something else: respect. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, the room erupted into chatter. Students swarmed around Karoline, peppering her with questions. "How did you do that?" one asked, genuinely amazed. "Did you study advanced calculus before?" another wondered aloud. Karoline smiled patiently, explaining that she'd always enjoyed math as a hobby and found it relaxing to work through complex problems. "It's not about being smarter than anyone else," she added modestly. "It's about staying calm and breaking things down step by step." Meanwhile, Professor Hartley lingered near the podium, pretending to organize his notes. In truth, he was avoiding eye contact with Karoline. Part of him wanted to apologize, but his pride held him back. Instead, he busied himself erasing the equation from the board, as though wiping away the memory of his misstep. When the last trace disappeared, he sighed deeply and gathered his things, leaving the room without another word. Word of what happened spread quickly across campus. By lunchtime, nearly everyone had heard about the chalkboard showdown. Students huddled in groups, recounting the story with varying degrees of embellishment. Some claimed Karoline had solved the problem in under 2 minutes, while others swore Hartley had turned pale as soon as she stepped up to the board. Regardless of the details, one thing was clear: Karoline Leavitt had become an overnight legend. At first, Karoline tried to brush off the attention. She sat alone in the cafeteria, eating her sandwich and flipping through a book, hoping to blend into the background. But it wasn't long before curious classmates approached her table, eager to learn more. One group of engineering majors joked about recruiting her for their team project, while a freshman admitted shyly that he'd started studying harder after hearing her story. Karoline listened patiently, offering advice where she could, but she never let the praise go to her head. To her, solving the equation wasn't a victory lap. It was just another day of using her skills to rise to a challenge. Not everyone reacted. Positively, though. A handful of students whispered behind her back, accusing her of showing off or deliberately embarrassing Hartley. "She should have just ignored him," one girl muttered during a study session. "Now he'll probably fail, all of us out of spite." Others dismissed these complaints, pointing out that Hartley had brought the whole thing on himself. "He's the one who threw down the gauntlet," a senior remarked. "You don't throw rocks at a lion and then complain when it roars back." As the days passed, the buzz around campus began to settle, but the ripple effects lingered. Class students noticed a subtle shift in Hartley's demeanor. He still challenged his students, still pushed them to think critically, but there was less sarcasm in his tone, less condescension in his critiques. During discussions, he seemed more willing to listen, even when opinions clashed with his own. And though he never explicitly acknowledged Karoline's triumph, it was clear that the incident had left its mark on him. For Karoline, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be for someone who had just become the talk of the school. She continued attending lectures, participating in debates, and working tirelessly on her assignments. If anything, the experience only strengthened her resolve to stay true to herself. She knew that intelligence wasn't about proving superiority. It was about contributing meaningfully, whether through solving equations or engaging in thoughtful dialogue. Still, there were moments when she caught Hartley watching her, his expression unreadable. Was it admiration, regret, or maybe just curiosity? Whatever it was, Karoline chose not to dwell on it. After all, she had bigger goals to focus on. Little did she know, however, that this wasn't the end of her story with Professor Hartley. Their paths would cross again in ways neither of them could predict, and when they did, the lessons they'd both learned would come into play once more. The weeks that followed the chalkboard incident brought subtle yet noticeable changes to the classroom dynamic. Professor Hartley, who once thrived on dominating discussions, now seemed more measured in his approach. He still challenged his students. Of course, his sharp intellect demanded nothing less, but there was a newfound restraint in his tone. Gone were the cutting remarks and sarcastic quips that used to make some students squirm. Instead, he encouraged thoughtful debate, even when opinions clashed with his own. For Karoline, this shift wasn't something she actively noticed at first. She continued attending class as usual, contributing her insights without seeking attention or validation. But it didn't take long for her to realize that other students had started looking at her differently. Some treated her like a celebrity, asking for advice on everything from math problems to political essays. Others approached her with genuine curiosity, wanting to understand how she stayed so calm under pressure. "You didn't even blink when he challenged you," one student said during a study group session. "How do you do that?" Karoline smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's not about being fearless," she explained. "Everyone gets nervous sometimes. The trick is to focus on what you know and trust yourself to handle the rest." Her words resonated deeply with those around her, especially the quieter students who often hesitated to speak up. Slowly but surely they began following her example, raising their hands more confidently and engaging in discussions they might have avoided before. Even outside of class, the ripple effects of Karoline's actions continued to spread. In the library, groups of students gathered around tables debating topics inspired by Hartley's lectures. These conversations weren't always polite. Sometimes voices rose and tempers flared, but they were passionate, driven by a shared desire to learn and grow. What surprised everyone, including Karoline, was how these dialogues began bridging divides. Students from different backgrounds, majors, and ideologies found common ground in their pursuit of understanding. It was as if Karoline's quiet determination had sparked a cultural shift, turning the campus into a place where ideas mattered more than egos. Back in the classroom, Hartley observed these changes with a mix of pride and introspection. As much as he hated to admit it, Karoline's presence had forced him to reevaluate his teaching style. For years, he'd prided himself on being the smartest person in the room, using his knowledge to guide and occasionally intimidate his students. But now he saw the value in creating space for others to shine. He realized that true education wasn't about winning arguments. It was about fostering growth, encouraging critical thinking, and helping students discover their potential. One afternoon, after dismissing the class, Hartley lingered near the door, watching as students filed out. When Karoline walked by, he hesitated for a moment before calling out to her. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Do you have a moment?" Karoline paused, glancing over her shoulder. She nodded politely and stepped aside, waiting for the last few students to leave before approaching him. Hartley cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I wanted to... well, I suppose I owe you an apology," he admitted, avoiding eye contact. My behavior during that discussion was unprofessional, and I'm sorry if it came across as dismissive or condescending." His words hung in the air, raw and unexpected. For a moment, Karoline simply stared at him, taken aback by his sincerity. "It's okay," she replied finally, her tone gentle but firm. "I understood where you were coming from. We don't always see eye to eye, and that's fine. But I hope you know I never intended to embarrass you. I just wanted to contribute to the conversation." Her honesty caught Hartley off guard. He nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Fair enough," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "And I must say your contribution was kind of impressive. I underestimated you, and that was my mistake." The admission felt heavy, almost cathartic, as though it lifted a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Karoline offered a small smile in return, accepting his apology without judgment. From that day forward, their relationship underwent a quiet transformation. Hartley no longer singled Karoline out in class, nor did he treat her with guarded suspicion. Instead, he engaged her in respectful dialogue, valuing her perspective even when they disagreed. Their exchanges became less adversarial and more collaborative, setting an example for the rest of the class. Other students took note of this evolving dynamic, inspired by the way two people with opposing views could find mutual respect. Outside of academics, Karoline's influence extended beyond the classroom walls. She joined a campus club focused on promoting civil discourse, helping organize events that brought together students from all walks of life. One project involved hosting panel discussions on controversial topics, encouraging participants to listen actively and respond thoughtfully rather than react defensively. These events quickly gained popularity, drawing crowds eager to engage in meaningful conversations. As the semester wore on, Karoline found herself reflecting on how far she'd come since that fateful morning. Solving the equation hadn't changed it had simply revealed a part of herself she'd always known existed. What truly mattered was how she chose to use her abilities, not to prove a point or win arguments, but to inspire others and foster understanding. And while she couldn't predict what challenges lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain: staying true to herself would always be her greatest strength. Little did she know, however, that her journey with Professor Hartley was far from over. Their newfound respect for each other would soon be put to the test in ways neither of them expected. But for now, the campus buzzed with possibility, fueled by the belief that even the most unlikely connections could lead to profound change. As the semester rolled on, the campus settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and refreshingly new. The tension between Karoline and Professor Hartley had softened into something more constructive, almost collaborative. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, and for Karoline, that moment came during a guest lecture hosted by the Political Science Department. The speaker was a well-known public intellectual, a fiery advocate for progressive policies, who rarely shied away from controversy. His talk focused on the intersection of economics, social justice, and government intervention, topics that naturally sparked heated debates among students. By the time he opened the floor to questions, nearly every hand in the auditorium shot up. Predictably, Karoline's hand was one of them, raised calmly amidst the sea of eager arms. When the speaker called on her, she leaned forward slightly, her voice clear and composed. "Thank you for your insights," she began, earning nods of approval from those around her. "But I'm curious about something. You mentioned earlier that large-scale government programs are essential for addressing inequality. While I agree they can be helpful, I worry about the potential for inefficiency and unintended consequences. How do we ensure accountability while still achieving meaningful results?" The question hung in the air, sharp and precise, drawing murmurs of agreement and skepticism alike. The speaker paused, clearly caught off guard by the depth of her inquiry. He recovered quickly, launching into a passionate defense of his position. But as the exchange unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just another debate. It was a clash of ideologies, played out in front of an audience hungry for answers. What made the moment even more intriguing was Professor Hartley's reaction. Sitting near the back of the auditorium, he watched intently, his expression unreadable. On one hand, he admired Karoline's ability to ask tough questions with grace. On the other, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of discomfort. Her arguments echoed views he'd spent years challenging, yet there was no denying their validity. For the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning not just her perspective, but also his own deeply held beliefs. After the lecture ended, the buzz of conversation spilled out into the hallway. Students clustered around Karoline, congratulating her on holding her ground against such a formidable opponent. Meanwhile, Hartley lingered nearby, listening quietly as snippets of their discussion reached his ears. One student remarked how refreshing it was to hear someone challenge authority without resorting to hostility. Another chimed in, saying that Karoline's balance of confidence and respect gave others permission to speak up too. Eventually, Hartley approached her, his steps deliberate but unhurried. "You've got quite the reputation now," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "First me, now him. Who's next? The president?" His joke landed awkwardly, but Karoline laughed, politely brushing it off with a shrug. "I'm not trying to pick fights," she replied honestly. "I just think it's important to ask questions, especially when the stakes are high. If we don't challenge ideas, even ones we agree with, we risk missing opportunities to improve." Her words struck a chord with Hartley, though he didn't let it show right away. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully and changed the subject. "Speaking of challenges," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "I've been thinking about organizing a mock policy debate for my class. Something interactive, where students can test their arguments in real time. Would you be interested in helping me design it?" Karoline blinked, surprised by the invitation. It wasn't the first time Hartley had sought input from his students, but it was the first time he'd asked her directly and so openly. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Sure, I'd be happy to help," she said, her tone warm but professional. "It sounds like a great way to get everyone involved." Over the next few days, Karoline and Hartley worked together to plan the debate. They met in his office after class, bouncing ideas back and forth as they hashed out the details. At first, their collaboration felt tentative, each of them carefully navigating the boundaries of their relationship. But as they delved deeper into the project, those walls began to crumble. They discovered shared interests, books they'd both read, theories they'd both studied, and found themselves laughing over small misunderstandings. For Hartley, this process was eye-opening. He'd always viewed teaching as a one-way street, with him imparting wisdom and students absorbing it. But working alongside Karoline reminded him that learning is a two-way street, or maybe even a roundabout, where everyone contributes something valuable. Her insights pushed him to reconsider assumptions he'd taken for granted, while his experience provided her with a broader perspective on complex issues. The day of the debate arrived, and the classroom buzzed with anticipation. Students lined up eagerly to present their cases, armed with research, statistics, and impassioned rhetoric. Karoline served as a moderator, guiding the discussion with fairness and precision. When tempers flared or arguments grew heated, she stepped in gently, reminding everyone to focus on facts rather than emotions. Even Hartley, who usually preferred to stay in the background, found himself drawn into the fray, offering clarifications and posing follow-up questions that kept the conversation lively. By the end of the session, the room erupted into applause, not just for the winners but for the entire exercise itself. Students left feeling invigorated, their minds buzzing with new ideas and fresh perspectives. And as Karoline packed up her notes, Hartley returned to her with a look of quiet admiration. "You were incredible today," he said simply, his voice sincere. "This wouldn't have worked without you?" Karoline smiled, brushing off the compliment. "It was a team effort," she replied. "Everyone brought something unique to the table." Hartley nodded, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer. What started as a rivalry had evolved into something far more meaningful, a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to learning. Neither of them could have predicted how far they'd come since that fateful morning with the chalkboard equation. But as they parted ways, heading off to their respective corners of the campus, It was clear that their journey was far from over. The success of the mock policy debate became a turning point, not just for Karoline and Professor Hartley, but for the entire class. Students who had once been hesitant to voice their opinions now approached discussions with renewed energy. The classroom transformed into a space where ideas flowed freely, unburdened by fear of judgment or ridicule. It was as if the walls that had once divided them, political, intellectual, personal, had started to crumble, brick by brick. Karoline noticed this shift almost immediately. In the days following the debate, she found herself surrounded by classmates, eager to discuss topics they'd never dared touch before. Some sought her advice on structuring arguments, others simply wanted to share their thoughts, knowing she would listen without dismissing them. One afternoon, after a particularly lively discussion about healthcare reform, a shy freshman lingered behind. "I've always been scared to speak up in class," he admitted, fidgeting with his notebook. "But watching you, it makes me think maybe I can too." Karoline smiled warmly, recognizing the vulnerability in his words. "It's okay to be nervous," she said. "We all are sometimes. Just remember, your voice matters. Even if people don't agree with you, they'll respect you for being honest." Her encouragement seemed to lift a weight off his shoulders, and he left the room with a small smile of his own. Meanwhile, Professor Hartley continued to evolve in ways no one could have predicted. His interactions with students grew more patient, his critiques more constructive. He began assigning projects that encouraged collaboration rather than competition, pushing students to learn from each other's strengths. During one session, he paired unlikely teammates, a liberal arts major with a STEM student, an introvert with an extrovert, and challenged them to find common ground on a contentious issue. The results were surprising even to him. Time and again, these mismatched duos produced work that was richer, more nuanced, and far more creative than anything they might have achieved alone. But change isn't always smooth, and not everyone welcomed the new dynamic. A vocal minority of students grumbled about what they saw as going soft. They accused Hartley of pandering, claiming he'd lost his edge since the chalkboard incident. "He used to push us hard," one senior complained during a late-night study session. "Now it feels like he's walking on eggshells, afraid to upset anyone." Karoline overheard the comment but chose not to engage directly. Instead, she addressed the sentiment indirectly during a class discussion. When the topic turned to censorship and free speech, she spoke up, her tone measured but firm. "Disagreement isn't a bad thing," she said. "In fact, it's necessary. But there's a difference between challenging someone's ideas and shutting them down entirely. If we want real progress, we need to focus on understanding, not winning." Her words resonated deeply with many in the room, including Hartley. He nodded approvingly, adding his own thoughts. "She's absolutely right," he said, gesturing toward Karoline. "Our goal here isn't to convert anyone to a particular viewpoint. It's to create an environment where everyone feels safe enough to explore difficult questions. That doesn't mean avoiding conflict. It means embracing it in a way that moves us forward." As the semester drew to a close, the campus buzzed with anticipation for the annual symposium, a tradition where students presented research projects to faculty and peers. This year, however, there was an added twist. Hartley announced that he would co-lead a panel discussion alongside Karoline, inviting participants to tackle some of society's most pressing challenges. The announcement sparked excitement across campus, drawing interest from students and professors alike. Preparing for the symposium required countless hours of work. Karoline and Hartley met regularly, refining the format and selecting themes that would spark meaningful dialogue. Their partnership deepened with each meeting, built on a foundation of mutual trust and respect. At times they disagreed, sometimes passionately, but these moments only strengthened their bond, proving that differences could fuel growth rather than division. On the day of the symposium, the auditorium was packed. Students filled every seat, while others stood along the walls, notebooks in hand. Faculty members sat in the front row, their expressions a mix of curiosity and pride. As Karoline took the stage to introduce the event, the room fell silent. She spoke briefly about the importance of civil discourse, urging attendees to listen actively and respond thoughtfully. Then she handed the microphone to Hartley, who outlined the agenda before opening the floor to presenters. The presentations were nothing short of inspiring. From proposals for sustainable urban planning to analyses of systemic inequality, each project showcased the depth of talent and creativity within the student body. Between sessions, Karoline facilitated Q&A segments, guiding conversations with skill and sensitivity. When debates grew heated, she intervened gently, reminding everyone to stay focused on solutions rather than blame. Hartley watched from the sidelines, marveling at how seamlessly Karoline commanded the room. There was no arrogance in her demeanor, no attempt to dominate the conversation. Instead, she led with quiet authority, empowering others to shine. It was a masterclass in leadership, one that left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. By the end of the day, the symposium had exceeded all expectations. Attendees lingered long after the final presentation, exchanging contact information and brainstorming future collaborations. For many, it felt like the beginning of something bigger, a movement toward greater empathy, understanding, and unity. As Karoline and Hartley walked out together, the setting sun casting golden light across the campus, neither spoke for a moment. Finally, Hartley broke the silence. "You know," he said, his voice tinged with awe, "you've changed things here. Not just my class, but the entire culture. I hope you realize how much of an impact you've made." Karoline glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "I didn't do it alone," she replied softly. "Everyone played a part, including you." Hartley chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe so, but let's be honest. You're the lion in this story. And I'm just lucky I didn't get eaten." They shared a laugh, the kind that comes from shared struggle and triumph. As they parted ways, heading home to rest before another busy week, both knew the journey wasn't over. Challenges still lay ahead, both inside and outside the classroom. But whatever came next, they faced it together, not as adversaries but as allies united by a shared belief in the power of ideas to change the world. As the semester wound down and final exams loomed, the campus settled into a quieter rhythm. The excitement of the symposium lingered in the air, but now it was tinged with the familiar tension of deadlines and cramming sessions. For Karoline, however, this period felt different, not because she was immune to stress, but because her perspective had shifted. She no longer saw challenges as obstacles to overcome alone. Instead, she viewed them as opportunities to grow alongside others. One evening, as she sat in the library surrounded by stacks of books and half-empty coffee cups, a group of students approached her table. They weren't there to ask for help with their assignments or to congratulate her on the symposium, though they did mention how much they'd enjoyed it. Instead, they wanted advice about something bigger: starting a student organization focused on fostering open dialogue across ideological divides. "We've been talking about it ever since the symposium," one of them explained, his enthusiasm bubbling over. "It's like we finally have a model for what real conversations can look like, but we don't want it to just fade away after everyone leaves campus. We need a way to keep this momentum going." Karoline listened intently, her expression thoughtful. She understood where they were coming from. Over the past few months, she'd witnessed firsthand how powerful it could be when people set aside their egos and truly listened to each other. Still, building an organization from scratch wasn't easy, especially one aimed at bridging such deep divides. She hesitated before responding, weighing her words carefully. "It's a great idea," she said finally, "but it won't work unless everyone feels safe enough to participate. That means setting clear ground rules, things like respecting differing opinions, avoiding personal attacks, and focusing on solutions rather than blame. It also means being patient. Change doesn't happen overnight." The group nodded eagerly, taking notes as she spoke. Encouraged by their enthusiasm, Karoline offered to help draft a mission statement and brainstorm potential activities. Together, they sketched out plans for weekly discussion groups, guest lectures, and even a podcast series featuring interviews with thought leaders from diverse backgrounds. By the time they left the library hours later, the outline of a new club had begun to take shape. Word of the initiative spread quickly, drawing interest from students across disciplines. Even some faculty members expressed support, offering guidance and resources to get the project off the ground. Professor Hartley, unsurprisingly, was among them. Though he kept his involvement low-key, he made himself available to review proposals and provide feedback. "You're creating something special here," he told Karoline during one of their meetings. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." With finals week fast approaching, Karoline found herself juggling multiple responsibilities. Between leading study groups for her peers, helping organize the new club, and preparing for her own exams, her schedule was packed. Yet despite the pressure, she remained calm, her focus unwavering. Her ability to balance so many demands earned admiration from those around her, including Hartley, who couldn't help but marvel at her resilience. "You're handling all of this better than I would," he admitted one afternoon, as they reviewed drafts for the club's inaugural event. "How do you stay so composed?" Karoline shrugged, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "It's not about staying perfect," she replied. "It's about doing your best and trusting that things will fall into place. And honestly, having people I trust makes a huge difference." Her answer struck a chord with Hartley. He realized then that part of Karoline's strength came not from her individual brilliance, but from the connections she'd built along the way. Whether it was mentoring younger students, collaborating with professors, or simply listening to someone struggling with self-doubt, she had created a network of support that sustained her and inspired those around her. When finals week arrived, the campus buzzed with nervous energy. Students huddled in study rooms, quizzing each other on key concepts and poring over practice exams. Karoline, true to form, became a go-to resource for classmates seeking clarification on tough topics. What surprised her most, though, was how many people reciprocated the favor. One night, while reviewing a particularly tricky economics problem, a classmate stopped by her table unannounced. "I heard you were stuck on this," he said, sliding a notebook across the desk. "Thought these notes might help." Moments like these reminded Karoline why she loved learning, not because of the grades or accolades, but because of the shared journey. Every late-night conversation, every collaborative effort reinforced the idea that knowledge wasn't meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared. By the time exams ended, the entire campus seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Graduation was just around the corner, and seniors buzzed with excitement and a touch of nostalgia about leaving behind the place they'd called home for 4 years. For Karoline, the milestone carried added weight. As one of the driving forces behind the new student organization, she knew her legacy would extend beyond her academic achievements, but she also understood that leadership isn't about staying in control forever. It's about empowering others to carry the torch. On the last day of classes, Hartley held a small gathering in his office to celebrate the end of the semester. He invited a handful of students, including Karoline, to share reflections on their experiences. When it was her turn to speak, she paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts. "This year taught me something important," she began, her voice steady but heartfelt. "It's easy to think success is about standing out or proving yourself. But the truth is, the best things happen when we lift each other up. None of what we accomplish this semester, whether it's the debate, the symposium, or the new club, would have been possible without teamwork. So thank you, all of you, for making this journey unforgettable." Her words hung in the air, met with nods and murmurs of agreement. Hartley, seated nearby, watched her with quiet pride. "Well said," he remarked when the room fell silent. "And if anyone deserves credit for showing us what collaboration looks like, it's you." As the evening drew to a close, Karoline stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against her face. She glanced back at the building, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything she'd achieved, not just academically, but personally. Then, squaring her shoulders, she turned toward the future, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. Graduation day arrived with the kind of weather that felt almost too perfect. Bright sunshine, a gentle breeze, and just enough warmth to make everyone feel hopeful. The campus lawn was alive with energy as families snapped photos. Graduates hugged friends goodbye and professors mingled, offering last-minute words of encouragement. For Karoline, standing in her cap and gown, it was a moment filled with both pride and reflection. She had come so far, not just academically but personally, and she knew this chapter closing meant another one was about to begin. The ceremony itself was a blur of speeches, applause, and the rustle of diplomas being handed out. When her name was called, Karoline walked across the stage with steady steps, smiling as she shook hands with the dean. Her eyes scanned the crowd briefly, catching sight of her parents cheering from their seats. Beside them sat Professor Hartley, clapping, enthusiastically, his expression softer than usual. It wasn't something she'd expected, a professor showing up to celebrate a student's graduation. But it meant more to her than she could put into words. Afterward, during the reception, people sought her out to congratulate her. Some thanked her for helping them study or for inspiring them to speak up in class. Others talked about the new student organization, already planning its first meeting for the fall semester. One freshman even joked, "You're leaving big shoes to fill. Are you sure you can't stick around for another year?" Karoline laughed, assuring them they'd do just fine without her. As the afternoon wore on, Karoline found herself sitting at a picnic table with a small group of classmates, sharing stories and reminiscing about their time at the college. They laughed about late-night cram sessions, awkward presentations, and the occasional disastrous group project. But beneath the humor, there was an undercurrent of gratitude for the friendships they'd formed, the lessons they'd learned, and the growth they'd experienced together. Eventually, Professor Hartley joined them, pulling up a chair and settling in like he belonged there. He listened quietly as the conversation unfolded, chiming in occasionally with a witty remark or a fond memory. Then, after a lull in the discussion, he turned to Karoline. "So," he said, leaning forward slightly, "what's next for you? Any grand plans?" Karoline hesitated, considering the question. Truthfully, she hadn't mapped out every detail of her future. She knew she wanted to continue fostering dialogue and finding ways to bridge divides. But beyond that, the specifics were still taking shape. "I think I'll start by traveling for a bit," she replied thoughtfully. "See some new places, meet different people. After that, who knows? Maybe I'll work on expanding the club's reach or find another way to bring communities together." Hartley nodded, clearly impressed by her openness to possibility. "That sounds like the right approach," he said. "Life has a funny way of guiding us when we let it." His tone carried a hint of nostalgia, as though he were speaking not just to her but to himself as well. Later, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Karoline wandered through the campus one last time. She visited familiar spots: the library where she'd spent countless hours studying, the classroom where she'd faced down the chalkboard equation, the auditorium where the symposium had sparked so much change. Each place held memories, reminders, of challenges overcome and milestones reached. As she stood near the main gate, looking back at the buildings bathed in golden light, she felt a pang of sadness, but also a deep sense of fulfillment. A voice broke her reverie. "Mind if I join you?" It was Hartley, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one, and they stood side by side in comfortable silence, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn. "You know," he began after a while, "when I first met you, I thought you were just another stubborn conservative trying to prove me wrong." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Turns out you were exactly what I needed. A reminder that intelligence isn't about winning arguments, it's about building bridges." Karoline smiled, touched by his honesty. "And you taught me that growth comes from stepping outside your comfort zone, even if it means admitting you don't have all the answers." They shared a laugh, the kind born of mutual respect and understanding. In that moment, it was clear how much they'd influenced each other, not just as teacher and student, but as equals navigating the complexities of life. As twilight settled over the campus, Karoline took one last look before turning to leave. Hartley walked with her partway, offering a final piece of advice. "Remember," he said, "no matter where you go or what you do, keep asking questions. That's how you'll keep growing, and helping others grow too." With those words echoing in her mind, Karoline stepped off campus and into the unknown. She didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but she trusted that the lessons she'd learned would guide her. And as she glanced back one last time, she realized something important. The journey wasn't really ending, it was just beginning anew, shaped by the connections she'd made and the impact she'd left behind.